This is Origin Stories, the Leaky Foundation podcast. I'm Meredith Johnson. I'm recording this on Monday, November 7th, 2016, just one day before the U.S. presidential election. And I have to admit, I'm feeling nervous. Tomorrow, we're going to vote to give someone an enormous amount of power over our society. So today's episode is all about power. What is it? What happens to our bodies and our behavior when we have power and when we don't have it? And what can we learn about lasting social power from looking at small-scale hunter-gatherer societies? Our talk today is the power paradox. It was recorded at the Leaky Foundation's Bay Area Science Festival event on November 3rd, 2016. Our speaker is Dacher Keltner. Dr. Keltner is professor of psychology at the University of California at Berkeley. He's the founding director of the Greater Good Science Center, and for more than 20 years, he's been studying human emotions from an evolutionary perspective. His work is focused on awe, happiness, and today's subject, power. His most recent book is The Power Paradox: How We Gain and Lose Influence. Here's Dacher Keltner, recorded live on stage at Public Works in San Francisco.
Thank you so much. That's nice. And it's thanks for coming out. In some sense, probably the last thing in the world you want to do is talk about power in light of everything that's going on, and you will be prevented from checking 538 during this talk. But I think there's no more important time to talk about power than right now. It's a very consequential time with respect to this principle of social organization. It's great to be speaking on behalf of the Leaky organization. I tend to take an evolutionary perspective on the things that I study, from compassion to awe to today's topic, power. So it's very fitting that I'd be here with you. And I very much look forward to your thoughts about this topic. So I'd like to tell you a little story. And it's interesting, when you write books, often you engage in this personal reflection and you think back to kind of the core motivations for driving you to the sort of absurd task of writing books these days. And as I was writing about power and summarizing the 20 years of science that I've done and a lot of people have done that led to the power paradox, I kept thinking back to this experience that my brother and I had when I was 10 years old. And it is an experience that no parent in their right minds would do today. When I speak to parenting audiences, there's not a single parent who would sort of make this decision. But it turned out to be the most important decision probably in my life, and it was foundational to the science. And it was this, which is that my mom, we were living in the Hollywood Hills in 1970, and my mom got her PhD at UCLA. And we were in a middle-class neighborhood with great schools, and the kids are doing well, and they were all off onto good trajectories in life, and you could feel that. And it was 1970, my parents were countercultural. They did the kind of the rural experiment, and we moved, when my mom got her first job, to the Sierra foothills, where she taught at Sacramento State. And we moved up into a small rural town that was in the poorest county of California at the time. And it was the poorest town in the poorest county of California. And it was like Appalachia. And it was an incredible place to grow up, right? It changed my life and my brother's life. We played a lot. There was beautiful countryside. There was always a place at families' dinner tables. The parents were preternaturally kind. But what I noticed on this little road that we were growing up on is that people were dying young. So if you start at the top house on this KO drive, the dad died very early in his life. The young son, who was in my brother's class, came to our backyard and jumped off the rope swing. And when he landed awkwardly, and my brother and I had done it thousands of times, and he landed awkwardly, it split his arm in half, broke his arm. We now know that's called child frailty syndrome. If you go down the house, across the street, there was a guy who lived in this house with the shutters drawn. I never saw him. And he suffered from agoraphobia, which is the paralyzing fear of going outside. Never went outside. You go a couple houses down was my best friend, Memo Campos. His sister had leukemia. His dad contracted cancer in his 60s and killed himself. You go a couple houses down, 3 families from Oklahoma. The mom dies in the 40s, dad dies in the 60s. And that was our street. And I didn't understand it when I was 10 years old. what was going on, right? And as I moved through graduate school and then studied power for 20 years, and really started to encounter that the science that I'll talk to you about today, which I think is driving the election in many ways, what I learned is that what was going on in this neighborhood was all about powerlessness and not having a place in society. That the powerlessness of my neighbors in this very disenfranchised part of California was shortening the lives of the people I lived nearby. And now we have a science that I'll end on that really speaks to that question. So with that as background, about 25 years ago, when I was coming out of studying facial expression with Paul Ekman, I got interested in the nature and evolution of human hierarchies. Ironically enough, there's really no evolutionary perspective on human power, or social psychology, my discipline, on human power for interesting, I think, ideological reasons. But what I've come to believe is really what Bertrand Russell believed in 1938 with fascism on the rise in Europe. He said that power is the basic medium in which we relate to one another. Much as energy is the basic medium in which objects relate to one another, power is the fundamental medium of social life. It defines every relationship. And today what I'd like to do, and I only have 35 minutes, and I'm going to get 20 years of my career into 35 minutes, and so, as I'd like to sort of provide, partial answers to 5 questions. What is power? How do we get it? Does power corrupt? Once I feel powerful, I always behave like Anthony Weiner? Regrettable name when you think about it, but, and the answer, regrettably, is yes. What makes for strong social systems that constrain the abuses of power? A very important question today when we think about what's happening politically. And then going back to my childhood, why were the people I grew up around dying young, getting addicted to crystal meth, ending up in prison, being roughed up by the police? And I've realized, as you probably would intuit, that most of the problems today that are driving our fragile political atmosphere are really problems about shifts in power and how it relates to the problems of today. So first up, what is power? It's funny, it has a negative connotation. Even when I say the word, it kind of has this, it evokes this feeling. And in part, that's because the social sciences and most of the thinking about power has had a particular orientation, and I would say a biased orientation, that's being questioned today, which is most people have thought about power as asymmetric force. I push people around. And I do it economically, militaristically. The great history books of power are about military innovation, right? Or I do it through the political system, as we're thinking about today. Very clear sources of power. But this analysis of power as asymmetric might through capital and military and politics bumps into some really interesting problems that are non-trivial. The first has to do with this facial expression right here. And this view of power as just force and might can't account for the enormous power that the penniless, voteless, 62-pound weaklings of the world have over us, namely children. This is I was on this great bike ride. These are my daughters. You'll see them again. We were on this bike ride to Zion National Park. Like all contemporary parents, it involved a lot of negotiations. And as a psychologist, I devised this plan of for every 500 pedals, they would get some M&Ms, and they were all jacked up on candy after a while. And I said, no more M&Ms. And these are the facial expressions that I encountered. Who won that negotiation? The kids did, right? And I was immediately like, I was kidding, here are the keys to the car, have fun. So we got to be thinking more broadly about intimate power. I asked this question, we're going to have you vote in just a second. Take the average citizen in the United States, right, walking around, and we have a sense of how they're doing in their nervous system. Who has more influence on that person? Taylor Swift or Joe Biden? Who do you guys think? Don't vote, we're going to have you vote. We'd like you to vote. Who has more influence over your mind or a randomly selected American's mind? Taylor Swift or Joe Biden? You may be dispirited by that, but maybe there's good reason to be optimistic. So indeed, Taylor Swift is up at 86%. This example actually speaks to a very serious development in thinking about power, of cultural power, the power of music, the power of ideas, the power of books, right? The power of television shows. Joseph Nye at Harvard has written about how really in the 21st century, the central power of the United States is what he calls soft power, which is the ideas that we give out to the world, less so militaristic power, hard power. And a lot of people have written about this, and your ideas confirm this, that we need to broaden our thinking about power. So first off, in the power paradox is, power is, this is a lot of sociology moving into this, and evolutionary thinking, and various disciplines. Really the better way to think about power is your capacity to alter the state of other people, right? It's just your capacity to stir other people's passions and thought patterns, altering the state of others. It can happen through money or politics, but today a lot of power happens in other means, increasingly so. What this suddenly tells us, or how this helps us kind of look at history in different ways, is it broadens how we think about how the world moves forward and changes, right? Let me give you some examples. This guy literally changed the world by writing an essay when he was 19 years old. That's Thomas Clarkson. He was a college student, started finding out about slavery, wrote an essay that won a slavery contest, got hooked up with the abolitionists, and literally went around the UK discovering the facts about slavery that led to the abolitionist movement and the fall of slavery. At the time, before he wrote the essay, 3/4 of the world were slaves. And then through his actions, a young guy, radical shift in our social structure and our economy. Most of the things that I'm proud of at UC Berkeley, the free speech movement and the like, trace back to this woman, who is Ella Baker, and all of the community organizing she did in the South that led to the civil rights movement, that led to the free speech movement, that then led to the anti-war protests. You know, when we go out and protest against wars, it really is this woman meeting with groups in Alabama and Mississippi that caused that. There is no bigger influence on our sexual relationships and social structures. No religious figure, no political figure has had a bigger influence in the 20th century than Margaret Sanger and the invention of the birth control pill. It was a crazy group of people who invented it, very unlikely. Before the birth control pill in the 50s, American women had 6 children on average. After the birth control, and were dying young. After the birth control pill, 2.7. Radical change in social structure with no money, no politics, but an innovation. And you can think of many examples. Okay, how do we get power? These people are curious. I could tell you about the research that we're doing related to those facial expressions, but I won't. So this question has deep roots in evolutionary thinking. And it's so interesting. And I wish I had the talent to do the bigger picture of where we are, but I'll give you some hints about, in the evolutionary context, how did human beings get power and influence? And then how do they get it today? And why in the world, anyway, I won't comment, but how in the world could this guy be running for president? But, so how do we get power? The short answer, and I'll give you some interesting data on this that may be reassuring to you, which is that game theory, evolutionary thinking, social psychology, a variety of different disciplines kind of converge on this idea that there are a couple of broad strategies by which we gain influence in social groups, okay? And they're kind of adversarial and bump up against each other. One is what's really most well known in our society, which is the intellectual offspring of this individual right here, who of course is Niccolò Machiavelli, the most influential thinker in Western thought on power, or one of the most. It's so interesting. How many of you have read The Prince? Oh, that breaks my heart. Okay. You know, literally, it's one of the, Wikipedia ranks it as the 32nd most influential book ever written in human history. Machiavelli, let's think back to the historical context. Machiavelli was out of a job. He was living in the country. He was disenfranchised. The Medicis had come in. He no longer had political engagement. He was in a state of depression, most historians feel. And Italy, and Renaissance Italy, although beautiful, with all of its Tuscan glory, was probably the most violent place in human history. And out of that stew, he wrote this book called The Prince, which championed one philosophy of how you get power: force and fraud and manipulation and taking people down, right? Here are some randomly selected laws from a bestseller that is a contemporary version of Power of Machiavelli. And this is kind of what is taken to believed to be how we get power in the different contexts of our lives. How do you gain influence? Conceal your intentions. Court attention at all costs. Use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your victims or your work colleagues or whoever those people are next to you. Heck, let's just get straight to the truth. Crush everybody totally, right, as a pathway to power. Very influential in different parts of the world. By contrast, there's this other sort of philosophical perspective that comes out of a lot of evolutionary scholarship that I'll tell you about, that you get power through virtue, through being good and creating value for other people, right? Aristotle championed this view, that it's really the good people that prevail in the various competitions of our life. So let's look at a little bit of data that look at these two different perspectives. And this is where it's so important to think about our evolutionary past, right? So here's data point number one, pitting these virtue and vice perspectives against each other. Christopher Bohm, who's a spectacular anthropologist down at USC, summarized in a prize-winning paper the observations of 48 different ethologists or anthropologists who had lived with hunter-gatherer groups, small tribes, who were living in the social arrangements of really our longest period of our evolution, 200,000 years, when we lived in small groups and a lot of our genetically based tendencies built up into principles of social organization, right? And this is his summary of who the leaders are in those societies that resemble the conditions of our evolution from 48 different cultures. The person who's a leader, male or female, is generous, brave in combat, wise in making substantive decisions, apt at solving conflicts, a speaker, fair, impartial, tactful, morally upright, strong, and humble. It definitely reminds me of this presidential election. Yeah. Isn't that amazing, right? The basic social forces in which our core social tendencies took shape evolutionarily, these are the folks who prevailed, right? And it just begs this historical question of what's happening in American politics? And you have your own speculations. I summarize a lot of data that's coming out of this evolutionary perspective that in the new social network studies that, with new statistics, we're better able to study how I have an influence in a social network. And that takes a certain kind of data and a certain kind of social, and there are a lot of people like Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler at UC San Diego. And it's really interesting, and I'll just work through this really quickly, how our influence is really exercised, as Michel Foucault said, in a net-like organization. And I think there's this new literature that's a counterpoint to Machiavelli that suggests that we have social structures and social processes, and even neurological processes, that reward us for enhancing the welfare of other people, right, as a principle of getting power. So what happens, let's say, in a social network, Maria expresses gratitude to her work colleague Samir. What we know neurologically is that expression of gratitude or sharing or cooperation activates dopamine circuits in the brain, the ventral tegmental area projecting to the prefrontal cortex. That's your reward circuitry. And we know that good acts in organizations, in networks, make the actor feel good, which is interesting. It's inherently rewarding. Then we know if I act pro-socially with a work colleague, that person is then more pro-social and cooperative in subsequent interactions. And there's amazing work by James Fowler showing if I am kind to Ariel, she is then kind and collaborative to other people. I'm not even there. Those people are kinder in yet another interaction twice removed from me. It's viral in spreading cooperation. And then I've been really interested in how through these pro-social effects and networks, we develop really positive reputations and get the esteem of other people that then motivate more pro-social tendencies. Just to give you a feel for how we've studied this in crazy ways in my lab of how good acts make teams more influential and stronger. It's a counterpoint to Machiavelli. One of the things we did, very timely, because the basketball season is upon us, we studied the effects of really pro-social touch on basketball courts. We coded one game of every team in the National Basketball Association at the start of the year. And here's what and teams touch each other 1:48, in case you're wondering, out of a 48-minute game. Here's what they do. They high five, they fist bump, they arm embrace, they bear hug. Men love to hit each other in the head to say good job. They arm embrace, they chest bump, they flying hip bump. And if everything's going amazingly well, they fly through the air and chest bump, right? And I would recommend this at work with your colleagues. Wasn't the Cubs celebration incredible? Like literally ballet-like as they fly through the air. And these are all acts of pro-sociality where you're encouraging, recognizing, celebrating, and the like. And what we found statistically, these pro-social acts actually, at the start of the season, make teams play better with the best basketball statistics. And people who touch a lot, as an old language of pro-sociality, make their teammates play better. Kevin Garnett was our most valuable toucher. Every time he shoots a free throw, he's 7'1", he steps forward and touches his two teammates. You barely even see it. He steps back, touches those two teammates back there. It's about 300 milliseconds, and those acts make their teammates play better through pro-sociality. So, okay, so we're gonna have you vote. Sort of get your intuitions about this Machiavelli versus Aristotle virtue perspective. Here's what we want you to answer. Having high ethical and moral standards is necessary to keep power. How true is that statement? Having high ethical and moral standards is necessary to keep power. Oh, so I would say the nod slightly, it's split, and that's so interesting. And I would love to know the gender of this split, because I'll show you some data. So here are the people who are kind of the Machiavellians. No way. Power requires you to be unethical. Here are the idealists. Oh yeah, you got to be a good person. These people are going to screw over these people. Okay. And that's politics, okay? And that's very fitting for our data, which is very interesting. Okay. Here's another one. Let's see where you guys are. People gain power through the use of manipulation and deception. People gain power through the use of manipulation and deception. Oh, it's getting worse. Oh my God. So 2/3 of you feel like, yeah, you got to lie and manipulate and coerce and deceive to gain power. That's really interesting. Oh no. Here are people like, no, there's one of you who's like, no, you don't need to lie. I met the Dalai Lama. He's got a lot of power in the world, right? Okay, very nice. That's fun. Okay, so we call one version of the scale that you guys filled out sort of a coercive model of power, and there's a more collaborative model that really thinks you need pro-sociality. What's interesting is coercive approaches to power. These are nationally representative samples out in the United States before Trump rose and we were all thinking about this. Tend to not have a lot of power, not feel like they have much control over their lives, tend to be poor, male, and want their group to be superior. And then they're really cool measures of how moral you are, and they're amoral. They don't believe in any morals at all, right? So it's this very interesting profile to think about. Okay, let me just, I suspect you'll have questions on this. I want to get to a couple of really important points before we turn it over to you guys. We've done there's a lot of work in how Machiavellians versus pro-socials fare in the game of power. One thing that historians have done is rated the great legacies of US presidents. I review this in the power paradox. And in general, Machiavellians don't do well in terms of having enduring legacies. Who's the most Machiavellian US president? Nixon, right? And ranked by historians one of the least effective leaders. And the great presidents tend to be on the more pro-social end of the continuum. This is a statement about Abraham Lincoln by a journalist of his era. Lincoln, rated by historians as having the greatest legacy in the US. His political genius was that he sees all who go there, he hears all they have to say, talks freely with everybody, and reads what they're written. We know this sort of adversarial, coercive strategy works in short-term contexts. It doesn't work as a model of social protest. I just talked to a couple of social protest movements today, and there are more violent, forceful types of protest movements. Historians have rated those in terms of their efficacy and do they work. Only 26% of the time do they work, compared to more collaborative network building models, which work 53% of the time. We did a study recently of US senators. We coded how narcissistic and Machiavellian they were in their delivery of speeches, compared to how virtuous and courageous and kind the tone of their speech was. I have to show this one. This was again before Trump. This is what one of our signs was of the narcissist and Machiavellian, is they tend to look kind of smug and self-gratified. And we literally coded where they pucker their lips and they kind of look really proud. They go, and that strategy in the Senate from the 90s got fewer votes in support of the bills they were interested in. A lot of interesting data that call this tradition into perspective. Okay, so that's social life, right? Is these complex strategies that we all engage in to different degrees of manipulation, Machiavellianism versus pro-sociality. And social organizations, families, marriages, romantic partnerships, they fluctuate in how those principles are working with each other. And we have to think of the social system that enables those different strategies as really essential to the question of the direction that power takes in any social organization. And there's a lot of interesting thinking literally from hunter-gatherer tribes, where this is really well developed, where various anthropologists have thought about how in the world do small tribes keep people from exploiting others, right? To small social groups and organizations. And in general, if the social system, be it a family, a workplace, a body politic in politics, if they have accountability and the capacity to stay connected to other people. It's interesting, Stalin and Hitler destroyed all the means by which neighbors could connect to neighbors, right? You break up the social network. If you have strong collective scrutiny, the 2008 economic collapse, as you know, the ratings agencies, they weren't even doing their job. It was an abomination. And then what we really value and what we afford status to are ways that we constrain the abuses of power. Really interesting to think about where are we today in terms of our political system. All right, so let me give you a little bit of data on the abuse of power and then return to my neighbors and this really amazing new science on the costs of powerlessness. Does power corrupt? And as Lord Acton said, a great social critic from the 19th century, does absolute power corrupt? Absolutely. And regrettably, I've made the case that having a little bit of power, and I'm not just talking about Donald Trump, I'm talking about everybody in this room, right? Once you feel a little powerful, you do well at work, you get that promotion, whatever the case may be, it produces this mental state that feels a little bit like you're on drugs, and you can get into a lot of trouble if you don't watch yourself. So let me show you some data. Here are just some findings, and I love these findings. If you have a little bit of power randomly assigned in an experiment, you're more likely to gamble away money, other people's money in particular. You take irrational risks. Who's likely to admit rude behavior at work? High-power people or low-power people? High power people, 3 out of 4, 2 out of 3 rude acts at work are from people in positions of power. This is a classic, nationally representative sample. Who's more likely to shoplift? Rich white people or poor ethnic people? The rich white people are more likely to shoplift. That blows me away, right? We did a study that came to be known as the Cookie Monster study. You randomly assign people one person a position of power. They're in a small group exercise. They're working on stuff for a while. Halfway into the experiment, we put down a plate of chocolate chip cookies. Everybody takes a cookie. They're really happy. Who takes that extra cookie, that last cookie? Indeed, it's the high power person taking that extra cookie. We code how they ate the cookies. They're more likely to eat the cookies with their mouths open, lips smacking, cookie crumbs falling all over their sweater, blah, 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 you know. And I could go on. We turned the Berkeley highway into the lab. We did a variety of iterations of this. My favorite, we positioned a Berkeley undergrad right at the start of a pedestrian zone. Do you guys know those pedestrian zones? White stripes, cars are supposed to stop. They're very dangerous in the Bay Area. A lot of people get hit, right? I'm not kidding. So we have this poor Berkeley undergrad who's at the edge of the pedestrian zone, and we have somebody hiding in the bushes tallying up the data. And he looks at the car coming towards them and acts like he wants to cross the street. You're supposed to give the right of way, right, if you're driving. So we have this complicated scale of how powerful the car driver is. The low-power person is usually driving an AMC Pacer. Then you got the Ford Taurus, the aptly named Honda Civic. Here is a Honda Accord, number 4. And then the high-power people are driving the Mercedes and the BMWs. Here are our data. If you drive a poor car, you always stop. You are a very moral, upright person. You're probably thinking a little like, God, I wonder if my tail light's out, if I get pulled up, what's in the glove compartment, you know, whatever. Okay. And if you're driving a fancy car, you blaze through the pedestrian zone 46% of the time, ignoring the law and the safety of the person. We got a lot of emails. We got an email from Audi, the car company. Can you look at the data for Audis? They actually are, their Audi drivers are pretty moral, right? And they have these interesting new commercials that I think played off this. We got a lot of people who are like, well, you know, a Prius is a 4, but I'm a moral person. So we analyzed the data on the Prius drivers. They were the worst. Which led Conan O'Brien to say, hey, you hear about these Prius drivers? They're more like, they drive like assholes or whatever. It's hard to drive well when you're patting yourself on the back. And I was like, I should retire, you know? So let me take 7 or 8 minutes to finish up and then open it up. So after I lived in this neighborhood where very few people graduated college, our golden boy, and a lot of people ended up in prison. Golden boy of the class ended up in prison. And a lot of young guys died young in fights and boat wrecks and weird stuff. You know, I wandered through the social sciences, and I started to hear theories about the underclass or the lower class who I grew up around. And there were theories like the culture of poverty. They don't have a culture that really is interested in succeeding. And I thought about the parents I grew up around. They cared a lot about their kids' success. Another one was, well, they don't like to work hard, right? That's a common ideology out there. Well, actually, poor people on average have 1.2 jobs. And the people I grew up around were working very hard jobs at mills and in construction that breaks your body down as a man or a woman. So that just didn't ring true. And there's just all this stuff out there. They don't have the right mindset or whatever it is. And we kind of forgot the obvious one, which is, what is it like when society disempowers you, right? We know there are historic levels of inequality. This is an audience that will be friendly to this hypothesis. There is not a thing you can find in human societies in which inequality is good for it. And I'm talking about from gum disease to we have new data showing in unequal parts of the United States, there's more racism, okay? These are the raw data on just poverty. That's the poverty level for US families. It's kind of striking. 1 in 5 American kids is in poverty. 1 in 6 or 7 kids is hungry. They're literally physically hungry. And what this science has started to show, and I think it's one of the most important findings in the health sciences. This is your stress system that you probably have heard about, the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. If I see threats out in the environment, and we used to think like, you know, big dangerous predators or spiders or snakes are kind of prototypical evolutionary threats. What happens is old parts of the brain send neurochemical signals down to your adrenal glands, which send out cortisol into your bloodstream. And as Robert Sapolsky has made the case at Stanford, high levels of cortisol are really bad for your nervous system. You know, immune system compromised, brain cells start to age. Telomeres at the edge of your DNA start to shorten. That's Alyssa Eppel. So there is this new literature that I review at the very end of the power paradox that starts to make sense of the guys I grew up around. And it's even worse for many groups today. We know if I'm around a place where there's a lot of racism, I will have hyperactivated cortisol in my bloodstream, right? As a threat to a disempowering threat to my identity. We know women, when they hear sexist talk or hear about sexism, it's the same effect upon the stress system. It hyperactivates cortisol in your stress system. We know, I've done a lot of work on social class, a very forgotten dimension of American society. When kids from poor backgrounds go to a lot of elite universities, quote elite universities, where it's mainly wealthy students, they feel stigmatized and threatened, and they have elevated levels of cortisol and the biomarkers of stress. We know at work, Jen Lerner, my student at Harvard, has done studies of leaders. These are leaders who have great positions, but if they don't have voice, they have elevated levels of cortisol. So I think the stress system, the cortisol system, which used to be hyperactive to predators and the like, has been socially transformed into being responsive to threats to our power, to disempowerment. Now let's go one step further. We also know this is the cytokine response. It's part of your immune system, and it basically is the inflammation response where little chemicals attack pathogens in your body, and it's like having a flu, right? And it's great in the short term when you have pathogens in your body, you need to get rid of them, or you cut your skin and your skin swells up to make sure it doesn't get infected. But being threatened and disempowered hyperactivates the inflammation response. So let me just end with this right here, amazing work that I review in The Power Paradox by Greg Miller and Edith Chen. Basically, the kids I grew up around, poor kids, really poor kids in the United States, by the time they're 5, if you look at their cells, are filled with inflammation and cortisol. Their stress, their inflammation response and cortisol response have become hyperactivated and discoordinated and are constantly on overdrive. And that means they're vulnerable to diabetes and heart disease and depression and anxiety because the inflammation response is a major pathway to those outcomes. And the estimates are, if your first part of your life is in the conditions my neighbors grew up in, you lose 6 years of life expectancy. And it probably will get sharper. So let me just say, we're in an amazing time in terms of power. And that's why this election is so fraught. It is fair to say, when you take a step back, women now occupy more power than they have had in 12,000 years. And in 12,000 years ago, we shifted from very communal social forms of organization, as various archaeologists have argued, to much more hierarchical organization and religious forms of organization that were bad for women and led to a lot of problematic social arrangements. And we're slowly, inchingly moving out of that organization. So it's a very interesting time. And there's a lot of reason for optimism, from the rise of democracies to new forms of influence. And obviously, there's a lot of reason for concern when you see what's happening in today's election. It's awakening that coercive approach to power. But I think a great time to be engaging in this topic in new ways. So thank you very much for your attention.
Origin Stories is a project of the Leakey Foundation, a nonprofit organization that funds groundbreaking research into human origins, evolution, behavior, and survival. You can support scientific research and outreach with a donation to the Leakey Foundation. For a limited time, all donations will be doubled up to $1 million. Visit leakeyfoundation.org, that's LEAKEY foundation.org, to make a donation or sign up for our newsletter. You can also find and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Transcripts are provided by Adept Word Management, Intelligent Transcripts. Visit them for all your transcription needs at adeptwordmanagement.com. Thanks for listening.